were back in England at 1918s. The year 1918 opened not with a shout, but with the grinding churn of troop ships docking in British ports, Liverpool, Southampton, Bristol. They brought the American Expeditionary Forces, AF, hundreds of thousands of young men known as doughboys, and with them, a tidal wave of fresh, loud, utterly foreign energy. Great Britain, exhausted, rationed, and grimly accustomed to 4 years of industrialized slaughter, watched the invasion with a collective, complicated stare. The British were polite. They were always polite. But their wartime stoicism was a mask for deep curiosity. They saw not the gaunt, mud-caked reservists they were used to, but columns of tall, robust youths, seemingly immune to fatigue. They wore their distinctive wide-brimmed felt campaign hats and carried equipment that looked remarkably clean. They talked loudly, laughed easily, and possessed an almost bewildering confidence. The confidence of men who had not yet seen the true face of the Western Front. The first and sharpest point of friction was economic. The doughboys were paid significantly more than their British counterparts, the Tommies. In a nation where rationing was strict and wages were low, the Americans' wallets seemed bottomless. This sudden influx of money warped the local economy near the training camps and transit zones. Elsie, who worked the counter at a small confectionery shop in a town near Winchester, witnessed it daily. The British soldiers saved their meager pay for necessities or a brief gift for a sweetheart. The Americans, however, bought everything. Chocolates, biscuits, and cigarettes were snatched up as soon as they were stopped. They didn't just buy a pack of smokes. Mind you, she recalled, they bought the whole tin. They were generous to a fault, but it made us all feel so terribly poor. This affluence translated into fierce competition in the social arena. The doughboys, being less constrained by class and military rigidity than the British men, were aggressive in their pursuit of female attention. They offered the cinema, the theater, and treats, luxuries often unattainable for a young woman whose brother or fiancé was earning pennies a day in the trenches. This disparity was the birthplace of the famously strained observation directed at the Americans: overpaid, oversexed, and overheated. It was a bitter joke, but one sweetened by the realization that these same men represented victory. The public house, the traditional heart of the British community, became a flashpoint for cultural collision. The Americans were baffled by the warm, weak beer served from a hand pump. Say, what is this stuff? Flat and warm? Don't the guns have ice? Private Frank Miller from Ohio complained one evening to a group of British soldiers on leave. The Tommies, exhausted and nursing their pints, responded with a mixture of gentle mocking and genuine offense at the critique of a national institution. Frank was also confused by the ritual of the round. In America, you bought your own drink. Here, you bought drinks for the entire company, a costly social commitment he often tried and failed to duck out of, leading to frosty silence and muttered disapproval. But beyond the beer and the money, the language itself provided endless confusion. American slang, swell, take a hike, I reckon, was utterly alien. And the Americans, in turn, struggled to decode the thick regional accents of the British working class. The inability to always understand one another, however, was often solved by shared laughter, a recognition that they were ultimately on the same team, separated only by an ocean and 2 centuries of linguistic drift. Away from the pubs and dance halls, the relationship was defined by cold, hard necessity. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of troops required profound cooperation. American units were quartered in vast training camps, often administered by seasoned British officers and non-commissioned officers, NCOs, tasked with whipping the enthusiastic but often casually disciplined Americans into shape for European trench warfare. Major Alistair Finch, a veteran of the Somme, found the American approach refreshing but exhausting. They question everything. he wrote in a letter home. An order is not just an order, it's a starting point for discussion. But they are fit by God and they learn quickly. Their spirit is exactly what we need. British women played an immense, often unsung, role in this mammoth logistical effort. Women in the WAAC, Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and other auxiliary services manned administrative posts, served meals in huge mess halls, and drove trucks loaded with vital American supplies. Their efficiency and dedication ensured that the doughboys were consistently fed and equipped, a reality that deeply impressed the visiting American officers. As the terrible news of the German spring offensive in March 1918 filtered back, the small frictions between the Allies faded under the shadow of a shared threat. The British public, desperate for a decisive advantage, watched with growing excitement as the American buildup accelerated. They needed the Americans, and both sides knew it. When news of American courage and efficacy finally arrived from the battlefields of France, from actions at Cantigny and, crucially, at Château-Thierry, where the Americans helped halt the German push toward Paris, the earlier resentments were largely forgotten. Respect was earned not through paychecks or dancing, but through shared sacrifice. The crescendo came in November, when the bells rang out across London on November 11, 1918, signaling the armistice. The streets were filled with an unbridled, cathartic joy. American and British soldiers embraced in the streets. Officers shook hands in official residences. The young Americans, who had arrived as slightly arrogant foreigners, were now cheered as brothers in arms. The Great Alliance, complex, often awkward, and yet fundamentally essential, had been forged in the crucible of war, marking a defining moment in the relationship between the two nations.